All right, what's next? Oh, question about Russian imperialism. So we had another question about. I mentioned in one of the streams Lenin talking about Russia being imperialist in his time. Therefore, it would be absurd to think Russia is not imperialist at this time. So the question was, you are a solid authority on this kind of thing now, up there with Finbal Defo, but where did Lenin say that Russia in his time was imperialist? Imperialist because it was an empire in that sense, or that capitalism had reached its highest stage? So this was my answer to that question. Lenin showed that World War I was an inter-imperialist war, and Russia was a major party in it. Capitalism was still developing out of the fetters of Tsarism in Russia at that time, but Russia already was hooked into the imperialist system by then by all kinds of investments. It was particularly bound to French capital, and it was rapidly conforming to that system as described in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Quote, thus, owing to the formation of capitalist monopolies, the merging of bank and industrial capital has also made enormous strides in Russia. So that merging of bank and industrial capital is known as the emergence of finance capital. That is one of the characteristics, and so there's Lenin describing Russia already at that time, although its capitalism, it was still emerging out of the sort of remnants of feudalism, already by that time an overthrown feudalism, which technically most of the main features of Russian feudalism were ended in the 1860s, but parts of it still went on, and there was still the Tsarist system and so on. But capitalism, and even advanced capitalism, was coming up quickly by that time, and there was one feature. So Lenin also listed Russia in that book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, as among the 6, quote, great powers that were engaging in redivision of the world in their capitalist imperialist conquests. These were the UK, the USA, France, Germany, Japan, and Russia. Quote, however strong the process of leveling the world, of leveling the economic and living conditions in different countries, may have been in the past decades as a result of the pressure of large-scale industry, exchange, and finance capital, considerable differences still remain. So talking about differences between the countries, even though there have been some equalizing forces, there's still significant differences. And among the 6 countries mentioned, we see firstly young capitalist countries, America, Germany, and Japan, whose progress has been extraordinarily rapid. Secondly, the second group is countries with an old capitalist development, France and the UK, whose progress lately has been much slower than that of the 3 previously mentioned countries. And then thirdly, a country most backward economically, Russia, where modern capitalist imperialism is enmeshed, so to speak, in a particularly close network of pre-capitalist relations, unquote. So anyway, there you have a contrast of the different characteristics of the great powers that were showing the characteristics of imperialism. They weren't all the same, but there were a few types. So, moving on to the next page. Regarding the rapidly changing state of capitalism at the time, so talking about the emergence of imperialism, the final stage of capitalism, out of the earlier stage of capitalism, non-imperialism. Actually, this is a terrible name for it. But the earlier stage of capitalism, which was not imperialist, the ascendant capitalism that was more progressive in its nature. Progressive in the sense it was overthrowing feudalism and transforming society. However, by the time it gets to imperialism, that's the end stage. Anyway, Lenin wrote, quote, we ask, is it conceivable, assuming that the capitalist system remains intact, and this is precisely the assumption that Kautsky does make, that such alliances would be more than temporary, that they would eliminate friction, conflict, and struggle in every possible form. So, talking here about Kautsky's theory of, quote, ultra-imperialism, where imperialism becomes peaceful. This is because the only conceivable basis under capitalism for the division of spheres of influence, interests, colonies, etc., is a calculation of the strength of those participating, their general economic, financial, military strength, etc. And the strength of these participants in the division of the world does not change to an equal degree, for the even development of different undertakings, trusts, branches of industry or countries is impossible under capitalism. Half a century ago, Germany was a miserable, insignificant country if her capitalist strength is compared with that of the Britain of that time, half a century ago. Japan compared with Russia in the same way. Is it conceivable that in 10 or 20 years' time, the relative strength of the imperialist powers will have remained unchanged? It's out of the question. So Lenin is saying here that because capitalism engages in this competition in terms of inter-imperialist contradictions and inter-imperialist competition, they're constantly shifting in power because they're all trying to get a bigger cut. So yeah, he's saying, will all of these countries exist in the same balance 10 or 20 years from now? It's out of the question. They're all competing with each other and shifting. So Russia may have been the most backward at that time, but would it still be in 10 or 20 years? You know, we would have a different situation. Not necessarily that Russia would be at the head of the pack, but we can be assured that it would be something different. If Russia was among, so that's the end of the Lenin quote. If Russia was among the group of emerging imperialist powers at the time of World War I, when they were having their first inter-imperialist war, then definitely after almost a century of higher level socialist development, would we assume that Russia's level of development was one of advanced monopoly capitalism, which is, Lenin said, if you had to summarize imperialism in a nutshell, it is advanced monopoly capitalism. There are other characteristics, but if you had to just use 3 words, that's the 3 words Lenin would choose, which is what additional modern analysis shows. And I recommended a video by Marxist Paul, Campism, which goes into how modern Russia under Putin, the counter-revolutionary post-USSR Russia, has all of the characteristics of imperialism in the Marxist-Leninist sense. There is the video. Campism, no, Russia is not anti-imperialist.